Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, our Armchair Art Tours Part 3 Nature Series. Today, Wendy will be talking about Emily Carr and the beautiful forests of British Columbia. I'm Melanie Blake. I'm the Director of Classical Pursuits, and I'm here today with Samantha Clark, Marketing Manager at Worldwide Quest, and of course with Wendy O'Brien, philosopher, Art Gallery of Ontario workshop leader, classical pursuits leader, gardener, nature lover, and all-time amazing person of our webinar series. Wendy's wrapping up her series today. So thanks to those of you who have been with us throughout this series and throughout the spring and summer as we've been doing webinars. Just a very brief review of the GoToWebinar features. I know that many of you know them by now. The two main settings that are important for you are audio and questions. To access each setting, you'll see either the word audio or perhaps an icon of a microphone or earphones. You can click on that to open up the field, adjust the volume, and adjust the other settings. If you are having problems with your screen or your visuals, please let Samantha know in the questions field. So you're going to click on the word questions, or perhaps it'll be a question mark that'll open up the field where you can type in what you need, send that along, and she'll help you as quickly as she can. Occasionally, there might be a little bit of a freeze or a lag for a moment because of the internet connection, and that usually clears itself up within several moments. We are going to take questions about Wendy's presentation at the end of the talk. So please type in your questions that you have throughout the talk, and I'll be back after Wendy's done to facilitate the Q&A. Just to let you know, so the nature tour series is ending today, but it is definitely not the end of our webinars or of our programming for the rest of the summer and the fall. We're off next week, but then we do have a webinar coming up with Dr. Bruce Meyer, who's going to be talking about Canadian writing of World War I, and I encourage you all to come to that. And on July 30th, we are having a literary quiz. It'll be a little bit later in the evening. This is at, of course, 2 p.m. Eastern. The quiz will be in the evening, and we'll have details up on our websites very shortly. But if you want to come play in the quiz, start thinking about getting a team together, and we'll let you know in the follow-up email today how you can sign up. We also have several seminars running for more of a small group experience. Wendy has seminars on portraits and personhood, and then she has two kind of connected seminars, one on Montaigne and another on bold, brilliant, broads essayists. And so she had a kind of bold, brilliant, broads essayists part 1 back in the spring, and now we're doing bold, brilliant, broads essayists part 2. So if you want to read some fabulous essays by Montaigne and by a variety of women writers, look for more details on the Classical Pursuits website. Sean Forrester, who you may remember from our first Armchair Art Tour series, he is running a seminar on solitude and beauty. And we still have room in our seminars on art and literature of the Jazz Age. I think we have one space left in Gilgamesh, and we have a new seminar on Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, plus several more that we're finalizing and will be announcing this week. So take a look at the Classical Pursuits website, online programs, and please let me know if you have any questions. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Wendy as we head west to British Columbia. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you all for joining me today. What a wonderful experience this is. I have to say, I was getting ready for the seminar today, and I was feeling a little sad. I've had such a wonderful time touring through different natural spots, going on these nature walks, and through these amazing paintings. If you've been with me over the last few weeks, you will know that we started off by going north. We went north and we hiked through Algonquin Park with the help of, I know this painting still makes me ooh and ah, not ooze, that would be bad. Ooh and ah every time I look at it. We went hiking in Algonquin Park. Since we weren't able to be there right now, since it's not yet safe, we went hiking in Algonquin with the amazing Tom Thompson. And then last week, we headed south to explore the New Mexico desert. And our guide there was the amazing Georgia O'Keeffe. Today, what we want to do is we want to return to Canada. And as Melanie mentioned, we're going to head west. We're going to go as, well, eventually, we're going to go as west as you can go. We're going to head here to British Columbia. And more specifically, we're going to head to this place. This is Vancouver Island. We're going to go as west as you can go. And we're going to actually spend a little bit of time here in Victoria, but then we're going to actually head up island into this area up above, into an area where there's so much natural rainforest. Now, this is the temperate rainforest. It's not the tropical rainforest we're going to take a look at, but it is this amazing place that we have a chance to explore. To give you a bit of a sense of what it looks like, the beauty of this place, there's a little bit more detail about where we're going. I wanted to take a quick stop. We're going to go north on Vancouver Island. We're going to take a quick stop here in Cathedral Grove. These are some photos I took not long ago when we had a chance to visit there. The reason I love these photos is it really will give you a sense of what the places were like when our guide for today, Emily Carr, was painting. So this is Cathedral Grove. You can see already why it's called a cathedral. It is an amazing place. It's a cathedral of another kind. Here I am with a bunch of my children, and you can see for us it's a deeply sacred space. It's got this amazing vegetation where, you know, things grow on top of things that have died, and things are always growing on top of something else that's growing, that's on top of something else that's growing. In this place, you'll see these deep root systems, and it's all about the trees. I gotta tell you, it's all about the trees in this particular place. The trees grow so incredibly tall here. It's hard to imagine. Some of these trees are 700, some 900 years old. Just to give you a sense of how big they are, take a look. This is the trunk of one of those trees, and those are our hands sitting there. You can see just how the width, the diameter of these trees. Perhaps you get an even better sense of it when you take a look at this picture. So that's my lovely partner in life. Imagine that's 6 feet, about 6 feet tall. Look at the size. They are awe-inspiring, I have to tell you. We've gone up island a little bit and had a chance to look at this place in Cathedral Grove. Now I want us to head a little bit farther west along the coastline to the Pacific Rim, to this area up in here, which is particularly beautiful. We're going to head towards, this is Long Beach, head towards Long Beach, head towards the Pacific, up towards, oops, that's the same photo, I apologize. There we go. Up towards, this is Chesterman Beach, just outside of Tofino, where when you have a chance to go inland a bit from the coast, this is what it looks like. Every time I look at this picture, I think, you know, it looks like an altar. And I have to tell you, it was an altar of a bit of a different kind. Yeah, there you go. It's true. We were married there last October, and the happiest day of my life. I had a chance to marry the love of my life in the middle of this place. And as a result of that, you know, it has a special kind of meaning for me. It's been written that something has called out of somewhere, and something in me is trying to answer. And that was written by this person, by Emily Carr, our artist in our guide for today. And I have to tell you that there's something about that quote that I really understand. In fact, I'm going to read it one more time for you. She wrote, "Something has called out from somewhere, and something in me is trying to answer." When I had a chance to spend time in this part of British Columbia, I couldn't help but think that that's what I was experiencing. Now, Carr wrote those lines in this work. These are her journals, and I can't begin to recommend them enough to you. The paintings are amazing, but the journals are equal in their insight into the place and into her work. Indeed, she said, she writes in here, that she wrote because she was trying to find equivalents for things in words. The equivalents helped me find equivalents in painting. Everything is connected. They are different paths that lead to the great it. And we'll come back to that it a little bit later. In that work, she also wrote that, well, she wrote of this place, she said, "I love this country and the people. It was my own country, part of the West and of me." And while I'm not from the West originally, I'm from Southern Ontario, I so understand something of what she says. I love this place too, and it has become so much part of me. Now, I have to confess something right from the start. First off, what a painting, hey? And remember, this is a copy of a copy of a copy. To see an Emily Carr in person is, well, it is a remarkable experience. The celebration of motion and light, of nature, of place. But I have to tell you, when it comes to talking about painting, one thing I had to come to grips with, and I like to say it that way because it sounds like I'm kind of over it. One of the things that I'm constantly coming to grips with is the fact that, I always fail the painting. And what do I mean by that? Well, the painting, there's always so much more there, so much more in the lines and the color and the composition, so much more there in the ideas that encapsulated it that, well, I always feel when I finish like I've failed. And I'm not sure if others of you out there get this sense or sensibility about you as you talk about paintings that you love, that you deeply love, that, as much as you talk about them and many words as you offer, there are as many words that you don't. And they're the wrong words, and it's not quite right, and it doesn't quite work. And yeah, I've taught painting for a long period of time, and I can't begin to tell you how many times teaching a work like this one called Above the Granite Pit, I would talk about the works in classrooms or workshops at the art gallery, or even here online with webinars. I would finish and I would go away and I would cry because I had failed the artist and I had failed the painting. And that's something you have to kind of reconcile yourself to when you decide to give word to image, I suppose. But I have to say, when it comes to Emily Carr, Melanie and Samantha and I were talking a little bit before we began today, and I mentioned to them that while Georgia's always on my mind, Emily Carr is always in my heart. And to speak of her work is a gift and a curse at the exact same time. So I'm gonna try my best to give words to some of her ideas and to this place that has come to mean so much to me. We're going to start off our exploration of Carr's work and of this beautiful part of British Columbia here. This is the house where Emily Carr was born in 1871. It's located in Victoria, British Columbia, and this is a map of what Victoria would have looked like around the time that Carr was, well, it's 1878 on it. It's the closest one I could find to her birth date. What's interesting about it is to see that it's not that far away. The trees, which will be so important to her work, the trees are not so far away from where she was. She's born in this house, and she's Well, I got to tell you a little bit about the Victoria before we get started. Victoria was considered the last bastion of the British Empire, and oftentimes it's described as the people who were there were trying to be more British than the British. And that's really important to understanding the trajectory of Emily Carr's life and of her work. Because, well, Carr, right from the start, she was raised to be a proper British lady. This is the Empress Hotel in Victoria, and she would go there and she writes these hysterical pieces about going to the Empress to have tea. Yes, that's right, off to the Empress to have tea. And she understood she had to do it. It was part of being a proper lady. But she writes about how much she had little patience for the activity. She was raised in a very Victorian family in a very Victorian manner. And that was a great advantage to her in the sense that, well, when she showed early artistic talent, it was something that was praised and encouraged. Proper English ladies, one of the things that they could do at this period of time was to become painters. She showed early on an extraordinary ability to draw and to sketch. And to be honest, I don't think we've spent nearly enough time looking at her drawings and looking at the sketches she created. I have to say, this is one of my favorite of all the works of Emily Carr, done early on in her life and early on in her career, called Snowdrops. I just love the image, but it's the technique and the incredible observation she has for not just the extraordinary, not just the big and the bold, but for the little things in life. Indeed, a little later on in her life, she'll talk about the fact that you should always focus on the ordinary, on the little, and look carefully, pay close attention. She was creating these sorts of drawings, and her family recognized that she had a unique talent, which meant that there she is. This is not, if you've seen pictures of Emily Carr, it's probably not the Emily Carr you know. Here she is. She's about 18 here, and she's just getting ready to head off first to San Francisco and then to London because of her talent and because she was a quote unquote proper British lady. She was allowed to travel and to go and to study watercolors in particular. Now, she was very proficient. She would create works like this. This is her chrysanthemums. And again, not a kind of image we anticipate or expect if you know anything about Carr. She was incredibly good, incredibly successful in her studies, both in San Francisco and in London. But she didn't want to stay in Europe and she didn't want to paint. Well, she didn't want to paint their place and their time. What she wanted to do was she wanted to come back to Canada and she wanted to paint not elsewhere and otherwise, but the here and now. She was so wedded to this place and to this country that she wanted to capture it in images. Here's her watercolor of Victoria Harbor. It's a far cry from what Victoria Harbor looks like today, but it's these beautiful watercolor images that she creates. She writes in her journal, it was wonderful to feel the grandness of Canada in the raw. And right from the start, that becomes kind of her guiding principle, that she would paint this country, not elsewhere and otherwise, though she would travel and learn in other places, as we'll see in a minute. But she wanted to always come back home to paint and create an art for this place and for her time. And she found here a unique beauty. This is her watercolor of Beacon Hill Park. Many of you might have been to Victoria and gone to Beacon Hill Park. It doesn't look like this anymore, but it was what it looked like in her time. But it is an extraordinary watercolor. And well, the reason I like to start by focusing on her watercolor, and those of you who were with me last week as we talked about O'Keeffe, you can see some parallels already. O'Keeffe also started in watercolor, but then moved on into oils. But what I love about this is you see her extraordinary skill. You know, she is like, look already at that sky and the detail of the flowers. She is so amazingly talented. And Well, and she's, like I said earlier, so wedded to recreating on her canvas this place and this time. I love this painting, but even more than this one, I love her arbutus tree that she does at this particular time. If you haven't been to British Columbia before, the arbutus is I think, pretty unique to this environment. Here's an image of what it's like. It's not a great picture I took of an arbutus. It's hard to capture what it is about it. I know it's got those beautiful arms, the branches that reach out, but what isn't really clear in this photograph is that when they get wet, they get this remarkable kind of red coloring. And they're so elegant in their twisting and in their turning. This is the tree that she would paint here, but something would happen to her. Something would change in her as she moved from watercolors to oils, part one, but also something else that changed in and of her. And to understand it, take a look at this image. This is what she painted for us in 1909. By 1922, she's painting the arbutus this way. And well, just for a moment, stop and think about the differences that we have between these two images. Well, I wish this is one of those times I wish I could hear your comments or read them while I'm here online doing the webinar, but so interesting to look at this transition between these two. Notice the way the palettes changed, but I think there was something else and something more that fills this space in between that kind of explains the transition from this image to this image. And to explain that, we have to talk about a couple of things. First off, we have to talk about a remarkable trip that she took in 1907 to Alaska. And that's her sister Alice there with her, following behind, carrying. Poor Alice. Alice traveled a lot. She was Emily's companion, not being able to travel on her own as a young British woman. Alice would travel with her and was often given the jobs of keeping track of everything. That's sort of why I love this drawing that Carr did of the two of them. In 1907, the two of them, having come back from San Francisco first and then London, the two of them would take a trip to Alaska. And Carr would say that that was the most important trip of her life, because that trip to Alaska would get her interested in the two great themes of her painting, the two things that would preoccupy her in her writing, on her canvases, and I would say in her heart and in her soul. And they're both captured in the image that we're taking a look at, which she painted when she came back from that trip in this particular painting she did in 1909. The two kind of themes that would preoccupy her were the forest and would be indigenous culture. And that real interest got sparked from that very early travel to Alaska, like I said, with her sister Alice in 1907. She went there and she found her themes, she found her subject matter, but she wasn't quite, it wasn't quite right yet. You see, this is still a watercolor, and if we go back a couple of slides here, it's still this picture. The subject matter might be different. The subject matter might be, well, the geography might have changed, and the addition of indigenous culture would be important to her, and we'll talk more about that as our conversation this afternoon goes on. But she needed something else. To be honest, it was watercolor was just not doing it for her. There was something that was missing. And in order to find that something, well, she headed off, as many artists did, in 1910 to Paris. She writes in her journals that everybody said Paris was the top of art. It was the place to go if you wanted to study. It was the place to go if you wanted to push forward, to get new ideas, to reinvent not only your technique, but to reinvent yourself. And that's where she heads off, 1910. She, and of course Alice, she and Alice head to Paris. And there she starts to paint works that look like this. Now, I know for many of you, again, this doesn't seem like the Emily Carr that you know. These are a series of paintings that we're going to take a look at right now that she did while she was in Paris. While she was in Paris and while she was studying with two really important influences on her life. One was Harry Felling Gibbs, and the other was J.D. Ferguson. From Ferguson, she would sit beside him and literally watch him paint. And she says it's this transformative moment to see somebody look at a scene like this one and to not be worried about all the details, but to capture something else, not the details of what they saw, but of how they felt. Ferguson was a great expressionist from which she learned to paint not just the world we see, but the world we feel. Now, those principles and those ideas were kind of enhanced in her and by her when she studied with Harry Felling Gibbs. Felling Gibbs was a well-known painter, but what was really important in terms of Carr's education was he was so well-versed in the great artists of the time. He knew the great artists of his time, and he passed on what he knew to Carr, and she would end up creating images like this one, an image we'll come back to in a few moments. What Gibbs did was he introduced her to, well, this guy, introduced her to the work of Cézanne, who Picasso said was the father of us all, of all modern art. Now, if you were with me a little bit earlier during our armchair nature walk, sorry about that, our armchair nature walks, you'll remember we've talked about Cézanne before. He's often known for his still life, but actually it was this image that I've talked about before with those of you who've been here in other webinars I've done. This image of Mont Sainte-Victoire, his amazing landscapes that he created of a place that looks like this. Landscapes that he created in this kind of odd sort of way because he was trying to show us the way our eyes see the world, which isn't neat and tidy and blended, but how each one of our eyes sees something a little bit different, and then our brain actually melds it together. That was important for the post-impressionists. That was important for artists like Tom Thompson when it came to articulating on the canvas what they saw, that it didn't need to be neat and tidy, that we see different things. What Carr learned from Gibbs, what she learned about Cézanne from him was that, but more importantly, it was really, well, this is another one of Cézanne's images of Mont Sainte-Victoire. And if you look at this one and the previous slide I just looked at, you'll get a sense that what he was doing across his career and the reason that he influenced Carr so much was that it was really a study of both form and of shape. Form and shape and structure. And she would take what she learned from this, and well, we'll take a look at this image and let's put it side by side with this other painting that she did from Brittany earlier. And can you see the similarities? There's similarities, I think, in the palette. I think there's also a lot of similarities, again, in moving away from having things look exactly as they are, the way our brain shows it, with two eyes smoothing things out, and getting a more of a sense of the shape or the structure of things. That's what she would gain from Cézanne and from her introduction to his works via Gibbs, who, by the way, was a friend of Cézanne. And don't think that Carr would have ever met him, but met him through a medium for sure. It was also important that at this point in time, Gibbs would introduce her. And I think from my own kind of interpretation of Carr works, even more important, he would introduce her to the works of Matisse. Now, Matisse was what we call a Fauvist. And for those of you who know French, you'll know that a fauve is a wild beast. And that term was chosen very specifically because the Fauvists, like Matisse, what they would do is they would paint quickly and they would paint boldly and they would paint, well, this is his portrait of a woman with a green stripe. This is a portrait actually of his wife. And I have to tell you, this is not the way she looked on the outside. She didn't have a line in the middle of her face that was green. But what Matisse was capturing here was not the way Madame Matisse looked on the outside, but the way he felt when he was with her. That's what the Fauvists were trying to do. They were expressionists gone exponential. They were going to show you not the way the world looked, wasn't going to be representative art or mimetic art, but instead what they were going to do is they were going to show you the way the world felt and the way the world felt in a particular minute. They painted incredibly quickly. They painted incredibly boldly. You see up here, for example, you see there's no time to quickly blend in colors or blend in the brush strokes. The reason why painting quickly was so important is that, well, Matisse and the other Fauvists realized that, you know, we feel something in and of the moment, and then we quickly think it away. You know, how many times do you get like the surge of anger or perhaps of love? And then you go, no, 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 no. Like you feel it, and then you start immediately to shake your head and think yourself out of it. Well, what the Fauvists were doing in images like this one, or this is Matisse's Red Room, and in images like this, he wasn't showing us what it looked like when he went home to, yes, this is Madame Matisse one more time. He wasn't showing us the way it looked, but he was showing us when he opened the door, how he felt when he came into his house. And again, big and bold and daring, use particularly of color to express our emotions. Really, one of the most important things that Matisse was doing was he was literally changing not only what we saw on the canvas, but how we saw things on the canvas. It was as if sight with the Fauvists migrated from our eyes to our heart, or, well, to use the term that Carr will use, to our soul. You can't look at a Fauvist painting with this. You've got to look at it with, you know, this. You got to feel these paintings. And if you don't, then you'll miss the best part. You know, what a beautiful, beautiful, joyous painting this is. But if you look at it alone and you don't dare to feel it, well, like I said a minute ago, you kind of lose the best part of the work. Matisse was all about the emotion. He was all about the feeling. And it was that idea, those principles, the notion of form and shape that she got from looking at the works of Cézanne and coming to know them through Gibbs, and then this study of color and its expressiveness that Carr would adopt. And here's one of her paintings she did while she was in France. She did a whole series of the French landscape. She would pick up this idea. She says in her journals, so many of us open our flesh eyes but shut off the soul. And with these works, to really appreciate them, what you have to do, and I would say to appreciate any of Carr's work moving forward from here, is that what you have to do is not just see them with your eyes, but dare to feel them. To see them not only with your flesh eyes, but also with the eyes of the soul. And when you do, man, look at what she was capable of creating. This painting, you know, you see so much of the influence of the Fauvists on it. Or consider this one. She was incredibly successful in her adoption of Fauvism. In fact, this work, which is called Autumn in France 1911, she would submit and it would be accepted at the Salon in that year. And, you know, like, can you see, look at all those colors and a movement away from direct representation to mimicking or mirroring what this mountain looked like, what autumn in Brittany and France looked like, to instead using shape and brush strokes, lines to get us to feel what it's like to be there instead of just see what it was like to be there. This work, well, look at the comparison here. Look at how many things that she gained from being in France in 1910 and 1911, from studying these great artists, from putting their principles and ideas into practice. This in particular, I was shocked the first time, I have to say, that I put these two works side by side at how much she adopted. First off, Matisse's palette, but also this idea of painting quickly and painting what you feel instead of just what it was that you saw in front of you. She would take these principles and these ideas, again, that she was very successful at. And well, you remember a few minutes ago, I showed you those two images of the arbutus tree, and I said, what fills in the space in between them? Well, and now we have, I think, a better sense of what happens between 1909, when she's doing this sort of watercolor, and 1922, when she's creating images that look like this one. She has this a trip in 1907 to Alaska. She sees this wild, open, beautiful kind of landscape. She gets the contact with First Nations people. And then she goes to France and she studies both Cézanne and she studies Matisse and the Fauvism. And she comes back and she creates these remarkable paintings that are so transformed. That her style, I can't begin to say, where she's been. She was good in the beginning. She had so much talent, but she will be amazing in the end as she adopts these ideas, these principles, and adopts them and puts them. Well, I have to say, a little bit earlier, I mentioned one of the things about Carr was that, she could have stayed in France. She could have continued, and maybe she should have. You'll understand this in a minute. She could have stayed in France and she could have continued to paint the French landscape in a kind of Fauvist style. And she would have been incredibly successful. I have a feeling she would have been really wealthy had she done that. But that was never her project. She always had the desire to go elsewhere and to learn and to experiment. But then to come back home and apply it to this place and to this space, to those forests, that temperate rainforest, like the one we saw in Cathedral Grove, to the coastline that we saw as we went up the Pacific Rim. And so she comes back from France in 1911 and she immediately starts planning what would be her most adventurous trip, a trip that she took exploring some of the most desolate areas, the most unexplored areas in British Columbia. It's a trip that she would take farther north, importantly, up to these areas you see marked here. Most importantly, I think, and often discussed, is her trip that she took to the Haida Gwaii. Now, before we look at what images of Haida Gwaii look like, what she encountered, let's just remember, this is 1912. And this is a woman who's traveling alone with her sister. Yeah, Alice went with her here as well, and her dog. We'll meet more about her dog and her pets a little bit later as we continue our journey through this area. But she would go there in 1912, pretty much, her and her sister traveling to this unexplored place, traveling to a place that was described by another traveler through this times as having treacherous terrain and dangerous water. It was remote. And even to get there, she would have to take a train, a steamer, a motorboat, a wagon, and a canoe. Just, can you imagine? This is this proper, this woman that's raised as this proper British lady. And here she is, daring to go off and have these adventures in wild, unexplored places. Places, as I mentioned, like here, the Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii is a group of islands. There you have a sense of it. This is, I know, I can just hear you all oohing and ahhing. This is one of the islands in Haida Gwaii, considered by, I think it was the New York Times, considered one of the must-see places in the world, but very hard to actually travel to and to get to. The Haida Gwaii is actually and I have a hard time with this word, archipelagia. I'm not going to say it right. Archipelagia.
Archipelago.
Thank you, Melanie, for saving. Archipelago. I had practiced. I even wrote it down phonetically and failed. I see, I can't do it. Okay, it's one of those places It's 46 to 60 kilometers off the coast, and it's this series of amazing islands with the most extraordinary uh, vistas, the most extraordinary natural environment. Take a look at this, for example. It's so beautiful. And could you imagine, these are images that have been taken of this place fairly recently, but could you imagine in 1912 what it was like to travel here and how it must have just been so, I don't know, it must have just blown her mind to see trees and images, coasts and forests that looked like this. Now, the Haida Gwaii is sacred territory for the Haida people. The Haida people have lived here for over 13,000 years. And like I said, it is sacred territory. As a result of that, now it's very difficult to travel there, and you have to get very special permission in order to be able to visit, to actually even walk on this particular landform. But during um, the Carr's time, well, here she is. Can you see her here? She was able to go there and to visit this place. This is a photo taken from the trip, which I find just remarkable. Can you see her here? She's right there. And I tried to blow it up, and unfortunately, the more I tried to blow it up, I just couldn't get a really great image of it. But that's her sitting there, sketching or painting in front of the amazing totems that she would run into there. Yeah, she came here. This is Skeetegate, and she would come here and well, it would be all about the landscape. Now, first thing, I know it's easy to get caught up with the images of the totems. I promise we'll come back to them. But first off, notice the landscape in here behind, and notice how much it's reminiscent of what we saw in Cézanne and what we saw in Matisse. The palette from Matisse, the colors as a way to express not only what you saw, but how you felt, and this use of form and of shape to express it via Cézanne. Yeah, she would come here and she would make these kinds of paintings. She would become fascinated with the landscape of this place, but yeah, I know your eyes went directly to the totems here. There's an extraordinary collection of totems that were in existence at this period in time in this part of BC, and she would paint them. And I know, like, look at this. And first off, notice the influence of Cézanne and again of Matisse, but notice how she's using it to capture a very different landscape and a very different culture. Notice the brush strokes and the palette and the colors. And well, take a look at these two to compare it. And what a remarkable talent she had for capturing this place and this time. Now, we'll come back again, as I mentioned earlier, to talk about the questions raised about her capturing of images of totems in particular in a couple of minutes, because it was a question that was not just being raised in the 21st century in response to our understanding of colonialism and First Nations people, but also that arose during her own time about her work. So hold on for a couple of seconds if you're going, what do I think about some of these images? Or we'll come back to it in a few minutes. She went on this trip in 1912. She saw all these places. She came back and she created works like this one and the ones that we saw previously. And in 1913, she would have a showing of the images that she created. And are you ready? Crickets. Nobody wanted to buy them. She didn't sell a single painting. Now, why was that the case? Maybe, you know what, people really wanted her to go back and paint. Do you remember that image, that watercolor of Beacon Hill? The climate of the time, you know, people wanted that kind of image. They didn't want, let's be honest, indigenous images to put up on their walls necessarily. They didn't necessarily understand them or appreciate them. They didn't find a kind of beauty in them. And further than that, you know, her use of Cézanne and Matisse, that was from far away. And how many people had gone to Paris or had gone to see exposition? This wasn't what they wanted. They didn't want art that made you feel something, art that you had to see with your soul or with your heart. They wanted art that looked like what they saw when they walked down the streets where they lived. 1913, like I said, she has this show of her work, her new works, and nothing sells. And that's really the beginning of an incredibly dark time in Carr's career. She wasn't able to sell any of her works. She wasn't getting any kind of publicity. She decides to buy a boarding house. She thinks this is a great idea. She buys a house in Victoria. She decides there's lots of people around. She'll have a boarding house, will be a constant income. It will allow her to, number one, eat, and more importantly, probably to buy canvas and paint. But it's 1913 when she buys that. 1914, the war comes. There's just not people around to live in it. And well, she calls that boarding house sort of the money pit. And some of you may understand this kind of house. You know, the sort of house that every time you turn around, something breaks down and it's another wad of dough. She couldn't get people to stay there. The people that did stay there often trashed the rooms. On top of that, there was the constant repairs. The boarding house was hard. It was difficult for her to get by financially. But I think it was also a dark time. She writes about it as being a time when she really had no inspiration. I think she was just so disheartened that nobody could kind of understand or see the value in the kind of work that she was doing. It wouldn't be until 1927 when she would really return to painting like really great works that she would. I was thinking about this earlier, what would happen in 1927. And I think what happens is she gets her confidence back. It's almost like she grows into herself as a painter. You know, she realizes that it doesn't matter what other people say, that she's going to paint what she's going to paint. And that will be all. And that will be enough. And you know, what an amazing moment that must have been for her to be released from so many doubts about her ability, about her subject matter. All that would happen, as I mentioned, in 1927. And in 1927, 26 of her pieces, paintings, but as well as some of her baskets that she did, as she did weaving, would be chosen to be part of an exhibition in Ottawa at the National Gallery called Native and Modern Art of the West Coast. Sorry, that was me getting lost for a minute there. And this exhibition, her being chosen to be part of it, well, man, how it must have changed everything. Just to give you a sense, here you go, you got 26. She's the most represented artist in this exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. In 1913, she tried to give some of her paintings to the province of British Columbia, and they refused them. They said, no, she's not a good enough artist. Thanks, but no thanks. The people who made those decisions, eh? But by 27, here you have not just the provincial, but you have the National Gallery asking for her works and exhibiting them. And it was incredibly a successful exhibition in Ottawa. Her works were on display and in conversation with works of some of the First Nations artists from the time period from the West Coast as well. And like I said, a very successful exhibition. It's so successful, in fact, that they moved the exhibition first to Montreal and then to Toronto. And it was when it went to Toronto, and it was when she would run into and get a chance to spend time with and meet these guys. This is the group of 7, a very famous photograph. It's one of the few that we have of so many of them at one place at the time. She would, in Toronto, she would meet the group of 7 and she would go to their studios and look at their work. And her journals are amazing. Like, she keeps so many notes about what she saw and what she learned from people like Lismer and MacDonald. She would go there and she would find kind of, well, I guess she found for the first time kindred spirits. Now, if you weren't with me for my look at Tom Thompson's work, I talked a little bit about the group of 7 there. Now, Well, what we need to know and what we need to remember about them is that they were painting the Canadian landscape. They had this commitment to painting the Canadian landscape, an art for Canada made by Canadians, not an art, to use the term I used earlier, of elsewhere and otherwise, but an art from here and from now. Now it's true, most of them painted not the Canadian landscape, but the Ontario landscape. But what they shared in common, and what I think Carr found a commonality with, was this idea that art had to take to the road and risk all the glory of adventure. Art was an adventure that you had to go out to. And think about Carr, right? She's already gone to San Francisco and London and Paris and Alaska. You know, she understood something of the spirit of adventure. She understood already something that art has to take to the road and risk all for the glory of adventure. And she also already had this real commitment we saw earlier to creating the art of this place, to creating an art, well, as the group of seven put it, the power and the clarity and the rugged elemental beauty of our own land. That's what they were trying to capture on their canvases. Meeting these artists, looking at their work, finding these commonalities, it started to shift things in her. But really what I think it was in this trip to Toronto that moved Carr, and would change the way she painted and the way she thought about painting, but also about herself, was the time that she spent with Lawren Harris. Lawren Harris, you know, she would draw incredible support from him. They would start a series of there's a series of letters between the two where he expresses, you know, his really detailed look at her paintings and his unending support for what she was doing. They would eventually have a bit of a falling out over religious issues. She couldn't quite follow his theory of, or his adherence to theosophy. We can talk a little bit more about that if some people have questions to it. But what's important about Harris is he gave her confidence in what she was doing and what she was creating. Now, Harris was interested in the idea of the North. And I know this is a long quotation, but his idea of the North, I think, helps us to understand why it was he found, well, Carr wouldn't go north. If you take the word north out of here and put west, I think you have such a beautiful statement of their shared preoccupation or their shared understanding of the creation of a Canadian painting, a new kind of painting. Harris was guided by the idea that the source of our art isn't the achievement of other artists in other places and land, that notion of elsewhere and otherwise that I mentioned to you before, although it has learned a great deal from these. As I mentioned, Carr learning from, you know, Gibb about Cézanne and about Matisse. Our art is founded on a long and growing love and understanding of the North in an ever clearer experience of oneness with the informing spirit of the whole land and a strange brooding sense of Mother Nature fostering a new race and a new age. So the Canadian artist is drawn north. That's what Harris wrote about his work, and it was north that totally fascinated him. He went north. He started off by going to places like Lake Simcoe and Orillia, but then he would go norther to Algonquin and to Georgian Bay, and then I know norther to places like Algoma and Lake Superior. Again, always seeking and always looking for, to use that quote again, the experience of oneness with the informing spirit of the whole land. He would go norther, like I said, here in this image that he did of Lake Superior. And then he would go, well, a little bit norther and wester when he created this particular image of the Rocky Mountains. And eventually he would go norther and end up in the Arctic. Now, as I mentioned before, while Harris was going north, northwest, Carr was going west, wester, and westis. And there's this commonality in their purpose and in their projects. Harris would actually say of Carr, she is one of us, one of the group of seven. And sometimes you do see and hear about the group of seven and Emily Carr. It actually gets more complicated than that. It's usually Tom Thompson, the group of seven, and Emily Carr. Again, this common spirit, and his encouragement and his letters to her changed Carr, I think, fundamentally. Now, what was it that she learned in particular from Harris? Well, I think it had something to do with, well, we'll take a look at this. This is one of Harris's pictures of the Rockies and, on one side, and then you get Cézanne's Mont Sainte-Victoire on the other side. And what I think you see is similarly, the similarities you see here is in really the use of structure, of form, and of shape in the creation of landscapes. I see so many similarities. I don't know that I've seen any works that have been done that look at the two in particular, but I see comparisons there. I think she was reinforced in this idea that you didn't have to represent everything you saw, but you needed only to capture the form or the shape in order to capture the spirit of a place. Not the way it looked, but the way it felt. Not what you saw with your eyes, but what you experienced with the soul. And there's something else I think she learned from Harris, and that was, it was really, his work is a study in space. Those amazing journals that I mentioned, they're sitting right beside me. I'm going to read to you a little bit from them. I hope if we have time in a few minutes. In those journals, especially the early parts of them, around 1933, when she started keeping them more religiously than she had previously, she talks about her need to study and to understand space better over and over again. She talks about trying to figure out space. And I think that desire to understand something of space really came from looking at works like the ones we are from Harris. What Carr does is she takes all these things that she's learned. And one of the reasons, I guess, I told you, you know, she's not necessarily on my mind, but she's in my heart all the time, is that, you know, she's in her 50s now, and she's still learning it. She's still learning, and she's still willing to change. She's still willing to experiment. She wrote this in her journal. She says, I think that one's art is growth inside one. I don't think one can explain growth. It's silent and subtle. One doesn't keep digging up a plant to see how it grows. But she was constantly growing, experimenting, changing. The similarity there with, you know, O'Keeffe, I was thinking about earlier today, you know, O'Keeffe said you've always got to try to make your unknown known. And they did know of each other's work, and I do believe that they met once, at least one time, O'Keeffe and Carr. But I was thinking about how making your unknown known was also part of what Carr's project was. Yeah. Anyways, she comes back from this tour. She's the talk of the town in Ottawa. It's kind of an iffy showing in Montreal, but she has this chance to meet the group of seven, and most importantly, Lawren Harris when she's in Toronto. And she comes back, and she's going to take this idea that art is growth, and she's going to change her style, and she's going to push forward again. And she's going to do that. But really importantly in this process is the fact that in 1933, she buys this. She calls it the elephant. She buys a caravan. And this is going to change her work dramatically. She's going to buy the elephant, and she, along with her collection of animals, she always had numerous dogs. This is her monkey, Whoosh. There's cats. What's missing from this picture, she also had a rat named Susie. I don't know why it was called Susie. What she would do is she would load up her animals, and she would go out and she would stay as long as she could each season until winter made it impossible. She would go out and she would live in the elephant amidst the woods, and she would create on plein air. the way that the Impressionists did, the way that Tom Thompson did, the way that Harris did. She would go to these places and paint what she would see. For example, she would go to this place. This is a Goldstream, it's now Goldstream Provincial Park. It's one of the first places that she would take and park the elephant. It is stunningly beautiful, a location. And here, amidst all of this beauty, she would paint. And I'm gonna ask your patience because I think I've mentioned her journals are remarkable, remarkable in their honesty. This incredible willingness to explain her process, to put it into words, to use the word I used earlier that she invents for it, to find the equivalents in words so she could find the equivalents in paintings. In this passage, I think she does a good job of describing what it is that you do when you go to a place like this and you paint. She says this, she writes this. Listen, this perhaps is the way to find the things I long for. Go into the woods alone and look at the earth, crowded with growth, new and old, bursting from their strong roots hidden in the silent live ground. Each seed according to its own kind, expanding, bursting, pushing its way upward towards the light and air. Each one knowing what to do, each one demanding its own rights on the earth. Feel this growth, the surging upwards, this expansion, this pulsing life, all working with the same idea. Rejoice in your own soil, the place that has nurtured you when a helpless seed. Fill it with glory and be glad. What a beautiful account of what it is for her to paint. What a beautiful account of what it is to create art. She would go to this place. She would live there for long periods of time, and she would create works that looked like these ones. She said elsewhere in her journals that only when we realize our kinship in spirit will we get understanding. And I think that's why she went and she lived amidst the trees. She was finding, she was finding her kinship. She was expressing it, realizing that she was as much a part of nature as nature was a part of her. And this would begin the period of her most mature work, where she created images that many people are much more accustomed to or understand or know much better. Things like this image of the big raven. This is the time period when she would create probably what are her most daring artworks, her most confident artworks. She would, at the beginning at least of this period of time, oh, well, here you can take a look at how, again, her style has changed. This was a painting of war canoes that she did when she came back from Paris. And here you see the big raven. And again, notice confidence. Notice that the lines change. Notice that the palette's even bolder than it was in this work from earlier on in her career. Times they were changing. She was changing, and her artwork was changing. During this time, she would go back to painting an image that she often did, the image of the totem. And there's lots of controversy around Carr's interpretation of Indigenous culture and Indigenous artifacts. Carr herself thought that she was documenting in these works. She was documenting in situ a culture and artworks that during her own lifetime she already saw disappearing. She's remarkable in her understanding of the politics of the time. She understood that Indigenous people were being assimilated and eradicated, and that cultural images like this one were being destroyed. And she thought that she would go to these places and create these images as a kind of way of documenting what had been the case before they were simply disappeared by colonialists. and it goes farther than that. She thought she understood totems. She wrote at one point that you must be absolutely honest and true in the depicting of a totem, for meaning is attached to every line. You must be particular about detail and proportion. She thought she was knowledgeable, that she had spent enough time in this place, that she knew and understood the totems. But well, she was in Toronto, and definitely in the letters between Harris and Carr that would follow after she returned to BC. Harris already raised questions about just how much a knowledge she had of Native culture. She raised questions. Well, I guess now we would talk about the question of whether she was documenting the culture of this place, or whether she was appropriating the culture of the Indigenous or First Nations people in British Columbia. It's a debate that continues to go on, and the place that we see it, or we've experienced it, is in relationship to this image. This is her image called Indian Church. It was created in 1922, probably the work that is most iconic of all of her artwork. Called Indian Church originally, as a result and in response to the findings and the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee here in Canada. This work, which is in the Art Gallery of Ontario, was renamed. It was renamed to be Church at Ucluelet Village. And there's been a lot of discussion and controversy surrounding this renaming of Emily Carr's work. The use of the word Indian in the original title, some would find offensive, but changing it, the title of it, does it change the meaning? I have to tell you, when I first saw this work, and I was touring it, when the change took place, and I remember the day, it was like, oh, it's called something different. What's going on here? When it was called Indian Church, I have to say, I wasn't sure. Well, Carr was deeply spiritual. She thought that all great artists had to be spiritual in their orientation. And when she said spiritual, I think she meant that. Well, she was Christian, she was Presbyterian, and wedded to a very specific kind of Christianity. As a result of that, she studied different religions. She studied, for example, Baha'i. She was interested in world religions, what we would call world religions now. And she was fascinated to see how other people lived, and not just thought, but how they practiced their spirituality or their religion. And that's true as well of the Indigenous or First Nations people that she encountered. Now, I have to say, when I first saw this work, and when I first was doing tours where we would stop and marvel at its beauty and form and color, I often wondered what the Indian church was, whether it was the kind of colonial church, or whether it was the trees that were the Indian church, and whether she wasn't involved in asking us to think about those questions, whether she wasn't asking us to think about, the imposition of colonization on the Indigenous people, or whether the reverse was true. I wondered, as a result of that, about the renaming. If we lose some of the complexity in the ideas that Carr was trying to express in the name of trying to be aware and respectful of Indigenous culture. It's tricky. It's a really tricky issue. I came across the concept of the paradox of colonial imagination, which I think is my best term for understanding her work. On one hand, she wanted to appreciate, to document First Nations culture, but on the other hand, she was appropriating it, and she would be selling works like this, and kind of caught in, again, the term is the paradox of the colonial imagination. What was she doing here, and how do we understand it from her time, but also how do we understand it in our own time? The Art Gallery of Ontario recently bought this work. And this is a work, it's part of a series called Intervention on the Imaginary by Sunny Asu. It's called Reinvaders, Digital Intervention on Emily Carr's painting, Indian Church from 1929. What Sunny Asu has done here is he's put a 3D design element from, and I apologize for poor pronunciation, I've been practicing, the Waka Indian, I'm sorry, indigenous tribe. He's taken these images from this particular group of First Nations people, and he's imposed them on top of it in a 3D manner. Now, his idea in doing this, he said, was he wanted to foster conversation about colonial gaze and about the legacy of colonialism, particularly in this area and in relationship to Carr's work. He did say he wasn't sure which was the Indian church, wasn't sure what she was exactly thinking in this work, but he thought that by putting these images on top of it, he would give us a place to discuss the legacy of colonialism. And also for him, being part of this nation, he said it would give him a chance to reassert active Indigenous presence in this part of British Columbia. It remains a complicated and controversial issue in relationship to Carr's work, and one I never want to kind of bypass. She herself thought that she was doing good and being good in creating these images, but she started to wonder herself about her understanding, her depth of knowledge and understanding of the First Nations people, and she would eventually put aside the use of First Nations images and artifacts in her paintings. She would, she said, turn to totems of another kind. Do you remember this image from earlier? Yeah, she would leave the totems behind and come to what she thought were totems of another kind. And she would begin to paint the forest. The forest, which she said is lovely, forsaken, and wild. She said she would go there and she would empty herself, make herself open to something that was bigger and better than herself, which wasn't easy. So many distractions and everyday life always impeding on her. She said she would go there and adhering to a kind of idea of artistic creation as divine inspiration. She would go there and she would empty herself as best as she could and become an instrument of something bigger and better. And when she could, she would paint. And she would paint trees, extraordinary images of trees. She writes in her journals that trees are so inextricably beautiful. I've been thinking about them, how in a way they are better than we humans. She would paint pine trees and cedars and yews. She would paint Douglas fir in this area. She would paint trees and trees and, oh, did I mention she would paint so many trees? She would paint them in the light and she would paint them in the dark. She would always try avoid romanticizing trees or the forest. She says this in the journals: woods are tender one minute and austere the next, sometimes riotous and rich in their color, and other times coldly pale. She would go there and she would paint the trees that she saw over and over. Oh yes, I know, so many trees, 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 and more trees with Emily Carr. Okay, on occasion, there would be water. This is her Untitled Seascape, which I have to say is one of my favorite of her works. Oh yeah, she would paint water. Here the seascape, and here, if some of you have visited British Columbia, you might have been near or by or on Telegraph Bay. And she would also paint the sky. She did skies. Like, look at that shade of blue. How did she do that? It's stunning to me. It just grabs me somehow. She would paint the sky, often the sky in motion, trying to capture the wind itself on the canvas. Or take a look at this example. Just look at the motion that was there. Or this image that I had you look at a little bit early on. Oh yeah, she would paint the sea and she would paint the sky, but really in the beginning and in the end, it was all about the trees. And she said about trees, we don't stop half enough and admire them. She thought that, you know, when we do look at a tree, and this is one of my favorite of all of her quotes, she said, quote, "We are very lazy experiencers, content with the surface instead of digging deep." Now, last week when we were talking about Georgia O'Keeffe, it might have been Julia or it might have been Babs, and I apologize if I have your name wrong. Somebody asked me if there was kind of a spiritual element in O'Keeffe's work, if she was driven by some kind of sense of spirituality. And really, we don't learn a lot about her spiritual life from her letters or her own autobiography. But from Carr, we do. You know, she thought that what she was doing in and through her work was, well, I love her claim that in her paintings, what we do is we capture a glimpse of God interpreted by the soul. That when you look at her trees, just to read that again, you get a glimpse of God interpreted by the soul. That there was this kind of spiritual element that you find in the works that she's creating. And it comes from, again, not being quote unquote lazy experiencers, but looking and not being content with what lies on the surface, but digging deeper into her images. To capture that kind of spiritual element, she's always, you know, experimenting with color and with form, and never, even in her most abstract works, did she want her paintings to become symbols. For her, she always wanted them, well, she says, to have the smell and the touch of the trees that she was at this point in time literally living amongst. Now, looking at the images, the beautiful images she created of trees, given her devotion to them, and I mean devotion in both an artistic sense, but also in a spiritual sense, it would make images like this one more understandable. You would understand why she saw that the clear cutting in British Columbia that had already begun in her time was really and truly, in the deepest sense of the word, heartbreaking for her. This is her painting called Odds and Ends. And she would do a whole series of paintings that would focus on, like I said, the environmental destruction of this area already in the 1930s. This piece in particular, I find kind of heart wrenching. And you'll notice in all her works, these stumps where we've seen clear cutting occur. She named those or called them screamers. And this is what she writes of them. She says, "It's a horrible sight to see a tree felled even now, though the stumps are gray and rotting. As you pass amongst them, you see their screamers sticking up out of their own tombstones, as it were. They are their own tombstones and their own mourners." This incredible devotion to the natural environment in this part of British Columbia meant that when she saw clear cutting happening, she created these sorts of works as a kind of early environmentalism and an early kind of activism. She would paint trees, well, right up until the end of her career. In 1936, she would have a heart attack. She would have a stroke, probably more likely. She and her health would just go downhill from there. In 1942, she would create this work, which is considered to be her last painting. Once again, we're here amongst the trees. She would, in 1945, finally die as a result of those complications associated with heart disease. I love this quote from Carr. She said to herself, and I would say to artists and to audience members who look at her work afterwards, she said, "Look at the earth crowded with growth, new and old bursting from their strong roots, hidden in the silent live ground, each seed according to its own kind, each one knowing what to do and each one demanding its own rights on the earth. So, artists, You too, from the deeps of your soul, let your roots creep forth, gaining strength. I think when we take a look at the amazing paintings that she created, how remarkably successful she was in achieving her own goal, in her, managing in this regard to put in place her own roots and to grow. The beauty of her work. She's left us this incredible legacy in her paintings, in her writings, and through her life about what it is, I guess in the end, what it is to really appreciate nature, not to use it, not to abuse it, but to look at it not with your eyes, but also with your heart and with your soul. Like I said, a remarkable legacy, a remarkable legend, and I am drawn to her work and drawn to her place. Something calls to me. And thank you for the opportunity of sharing some of my thoughts and reflections on her work with you today, because I feel that call, that something from somewhere once again. Thank you so much for listening to this talk on Emily Carr. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you. Wow.
What work, eh? Isn't she incredible?
Yeah. It makes me. I've driven from San Francisco up to the Olympic Peninsula, and this makes me want to keep going up farther, farther, farther. And of course, I should say, as we get ready for questions here, I was very remiss in the beginning. So you can go to British Columbia with Wendy in the spring of 2021. And I believe the information is up on the Worldwide Quest website now. Is that true, Wendy, or you're not sure?
I think Samantha might be able to tell us.
Yeah, Samantha, could you help me out? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. We just finalized the last of the tour details this week, so we're working on getting everything up. And I plan to reach out to everyone that's attended Wendy's webinars to give them all the details early next week.
Yeah, where we're headed is, I think I showed you a picture a little earlier. We're headed to Long Beach, actually, to this place. This is Long Beach Resort. You can see it, it's on the Pacific coast. We're gonna have an opportunity to think about our relationship with nature via the help of not only Emily Carr, but other writers and poets from BC and beyond. So we'll have a chance to explore this area up close and in person, and to do some reflecting on our place in space in the natural order, and the natural order's place in space in us. We're gonna spend some time thinking about our nature in all the meanings of that term. I'm gonna flip back to Emily.
Okay, so let me get my questions going here. Just a few comments. People, they've really enjoyed the entire series. From Charmaine, Mary, Peggy says, thank you for a fabulous series. So thanks, Wendy, for these past few weeks. And let's see. All right. And everyone, do type in questions if you have them. It is definitely not too late to submit a question. So let me start here. Okay, Angela asks a question about her travels in this section of British Columbia. Would she have a guide when visiting the Haida Gwaii or other areas?
She was she had friends in places and friends of friends that would help her. Not necessarily a guide, but sort of introductions. But oftentimes she would just like book a trip and off she would go. And how she managed all of this. Actually, I have to give great credit to Alice Carr, who I think is the unsung hero, because I think much of the organization was left to Alice while Emily painted. But yeah, she just had this kind of boldness and this daring. And we saw earlier images of her from her trip in 1911 there. And you know what, I've never seen her with a guide per se, but like I said, she did get letters of introductions, and She would find people who knew people who knew people. She was not shy, shall we say. Emily Carr was always pretty forthright, and if she had an idea and if she was planning a trip, she would make it happen. And so, not necessarily a guide in our sense of it, but she would have people who would help to introduce her to other people and to translate when necessary. Also interesting to keep in mind, because of colonialization, a lot of people were already there. There was a lot of influences, obviously, of the church in the places that she was going, so she would connect with those people, and that would give her kind of an introduction. Thank you for the question. It's a good one.
Thanks, Wendy. Another kind of practical question from Ian, who says, who asks, is the Carr homestead still in Beacon Hill? And he says his mother-in-law had a friend in the early 1940s who was Carr's housekeeper. This woman is now 93. She was a Japanese Canadian woman from Victoria.
Now, I'm not about the boarding house in Beacon Hill. The house that we saw earlier, the house where Carr was born, their family home, is actually the Emily Carr Museum in Victoria. And if you have a chance to go there, number one, check the dates, it's open. But we ended up being there on a day when it wasn't open. But we did spend a lot of time there because they have copies of the images all around the house, and you can look in the windows, but they have images and quotes from Carr that kind of surround the house. So that's right in Victoria, and you can have a chance to go see that. Also close to there, if you're in Victoria, some of the totems have been moved there, and you'll have a chance to, to see First Nation people working on carvings in there. Whether her house in Beacon Park is there, I don't believe it is. She would have the boarding house, and then she would eventually have to give it up. She would sell it. It was just too much work for her. She would move elsewhere. I don't think, because she wasn't Emily Carr, the famous painter at that time. I think it's eventually bulldozed. But I tell you what, Ian, I will double check on that. I'm pretty sure it's not there anymore, but I just don't want to mislead you. So look in our notes that we'll send you for some more information about the boarding house that she had.
Thanks, Wendy. A couple people are asking, why is she signing her work M. Carr or M.E. Carr?
Good question. I think it was just her short form of her own name. I've wondered this question a lot, and actually I asked a curator that at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where we have not a lot of her pieces, but we have a few pieces. That's the other great thing about being in Victoria, if you have an opportunity. So many of her works, great works by her that are there. There's some as well in the McMichael Gallery in Ontario, but really Victoria is the place to go, as well as Vancouver's art galleries to see Carr's work. I think it was just her short form for herself. Maybe it was a nom de plume. Maybe it was easier to be her initials than it was to be Emily. And the reason I say that, I can say that for two reasons. The first reason is she faced incredible discrimination. She's told over and over again, and she recounts this in her diaries, in her journals, that women couldn't be painters. Like right through to the end of her life in the 1940s, she's being told, women aren't painters. It's just a hobby. You're just an amateur. And the reason I link that to initials is much later in life. I'm, as you know, a philosopher by training. I used to use my initials all the time. I never used my name, Wendy, when I first started publishing papers. And the reason why is I didn't want to be judged by as being a woman philosopher. I wanted to be taken seriously. So I thought I shouldn't use my name. So it was W.J. O'Brien and not Wendy Joyce O'Brien. So I kind of wonder about that. But I found nobody who can actually give me an explanation of it. And it's a question that I've been really interested in. So I'm going to say I don't know, and I don't know that we know why she used those initials.
Wow. Well, she wouldn't be the first woman to do it if
Yeah, you know what? Some of the things that she recounts that she's told, like women can't be painters. She's at some of the associations and societies for art in Toronto for sure, but also in Victoria where she was living in Vancouver over and over again. Or people who would come to take a look at her paintings. She would use her home as a studio, and people would just show up and go, "Are you that Emily Carr?" And she would say, "Yeah," and she would show the paintings, much as they are in this particular image that we're taking a look at. And they would regularly say things, "Oh, they're okay for a woman," and then try to haggle her down on their prices because she was a woman painter. So it was part of the time and part of the era, and you know, I don't even know where to begin. I did know some of the people in my amazing Bold Brilliant Broads 20th century women painters group are watching today. Hello, you all. Thank you so much, because we talked about Emily Carr, and it's hard for us to reconcile ourselves to that fact maybe today, but very much part of the not so distant past.
yeah, and the present. But that's a whole other story. Okay, so Peter is asking
the next version. Yes, thank you.
Peter is asking, are these watercolors? So I think he's referring to some of the earlier ones that you were showing.
Yes.
You pointed out some that were definitely watercolors, but then you showed like the mountain, like Autumn in France, 1911, and a couple of those in that part of the presentation. Are those watercolors?
Some of them are. When she was in France, she first starts experimenting with oils. She makes that transition. So some of them are watercolors, and then some of them are oils. When she comes back, she's pretty much committed to oil. And again, it has to do with Matisse, because with oils, you get that boldness of color versus, the more gentle kind of watercolor image. So that's when the real transition starts to take place. She would continue to use watercolors right up until the end of her life. She would go back and forth. In fact, I think the painting that you see right here behind her, I think I showed it a few minutes ago. I believe it's actually a watercolor, not an oil that she used, because she could get motion in watercolor. And I know some of you may be painters. The great thing about watercolor is that you can get that flow, you can get that kind of motion that with oil, it's much more difficult to try to achieve. So she would always kind of go back and forth, and it starts really when she's in France. Her first real experimentation with oil starts there. And again, I think it's linked to this idea that painting was no longer going to be about what we see, but what the soul felt. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Wendy. Sam, how are we doing on time? I know I think we have time for a few more questions. I do want to get to as many as I can. Keep going. Okay. So a question from Phyllis, who asks about her Emily's sister Alice. Did she also paint, and what did she do for a living?
No, and so Alice was not a painter, as far as I know. Alice, there were 4 sisters, the Carrs, and they were raised in a very Victorian manner, and they were incredibly devoted to each other, which is something that is so lovely to read about, both in her journals and also many of the biographies make this really clear, that right to the very end of Carr's life, there was this incredible devotion to her sisters. And Alice, I think, sort of just, I sort of want to write a novel about Alice and all the things she must have seen and all the things she must have done. And Carr does those amazing kind of almost caricatures of the two of them on their adventures. But she really took it to be Emily's, support right from the beginning. She was expected to be her companion. Again, remember, we're thinking about women who were raised very British, very Victorian British. Emily Carr could not travel to San Francisco, let alone to London or Paris or Alaska on her own. And her sister seemed to just, I don't know, except that was her role, that Emily had this kind of talent, this kind of, I would say, genius, and she just devoted the rest of her life to helping her express that. So no, Alice didn't paint Phyllis. She was, like many people who are kind of lost to art history, which is why I said I'd like to write a novel, I think, about Alice and all the things she saw, because, she actually did more probably to create Emily Carr than anybody else did. I know Harris had huge influence in giving her confidence, but in terms of the ordinary and the everyday, that would have been Alice. So, there's so many in the history, especially of women painters, of amazing other women who support and do the day-to-day work, and, more power to them. And yeah, we need to praise them. Thank you for the question, Phyllis.
I have a question from Bill about the Indian church or church at Yakwa village that you showed. So Bill says, to my mind, the forest dominates. The church, in spite of its brightness and central place in the painting, is insignificant. The trees and nature take over. He says, am I wrong in this impression of the painting?
So Bill, this is, like I said, very controversial. What is the church? The Indian church. Okay, so Indian was the word from the time, and I have to say, I've spent a lot of time with the journals, as you could probably tell, which inspire me so much. I can't begin to tell you how much they inspire me to keep working and to keep looking and to not be a lazy experiencer. I love that idea. But, when I look at her works, in that work in particular, while Indian was the term of the day, and now we would say First Nations, you know what? I think it's the trees that is the church. And I think she is making a commentary on colonialism. And, her writings on First Nations art aren't always the most grounded in her listening to what First Nation people were doing. And you notice I have to carefully choose my words in this regard, because it is a delicate issue. For me, I think it's the trees along with you. I think it is the trees that is the church, and that she is making a commentary on what happens when settlers come into the place and put in their church. And like I said, reading her journals in particular on the issue of spirituality, I think is so important, because she did undertake a real look at world religions. She studied and tried to understand many different religious practices, thinking that, well, I have to tell you that my amazing mother, who is no longer with us, one of the things that she raised me with is that there was this idea that there are many faces to God, and that, or to the divine, and that each religion gave us a different glimpse or view of the divine, a different side or aspect of their profile or portrait. And when I look at Carr's work, that's what I sort of think she's doing. And when I read her writings, I think that. I mentioned her big debate and with Lawren Harris. Harris was an incredible supporter of Carr's, and Carr originally was attracted to his notion of theosophy, which is a word that I used earlier. And theosophy was this combination of religion, primarily from the East, and philosophy. It was this kind of hybrid between those two, between world religions and philosophical notions. And Harris introduces Carr to it. As I said, she was really interested in world religions. And so for a while, she practices and she tries to read and to understand. Eventually, she would say it was just too much work. And there was a kind of beautiful simplicity to the kind of Christianity she was raised with. And Harris would actually split with Carr for a period of time over this issue. But it seems to me that Carr was always looking for, and I know, Mom, wherever you are, she was always looking for the more complex notion of the divine. She was always looking to try to see and understand what other religions could find in the notion of the divine and incorporating it into her own views. And so, that Indian church, which is it that is the church? Which is the true church? Or is it somewhere in between? What do we gain from the combination of the two? From making more complex our understanding or our notion of spirituality? I think that's what something that she's onto. And so, Bill, I'm with you. I am, I work for the Art Gallery of Ontario. I understand the argument that was made, but I think we lose something of the meaning of Carr's work in changing the title of that. And it's a big debate amongst Emily Carr scholars, let me tell you. And it will be ongoing. And thank goodness for Sunny Sue for entering into that conversation by adding a new layer of Indigenous imagery to get us to think about the multiplicity of views that we can have on it. Anyway, long answer.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Wendy.
But it's such an important question.
Just a couple more questions. So to follow up about the journals that you've read from and mentioned several times, Bobby asks, how many years did she keep a journal? Did she start doing this when she was young or when she became an artist? And Bobby says she loves to read journals and she keeps one as well.
Oh, Bobby, you and I are kindred souls. I have my journal since I was 12 years old. Nobody should read what I wrote when I was 12. It's so embarrassing. But I have boxes and boxes of them. And along with having some friends who have done workshops with me, I know a couple of my kids are with me. And yes, you get to inherit them all. Her journals, in this version that you saw before, called Hundreds and Thousands, it's the image I had up earlier. It's the journals of Emily Carr. They start in 1927. But there are also the unpublished journals of Emily Carr, which were released a little bit earlier, which they predate 1927. She kept them, I think she kept them throughout most of her life. I think she was always writing. And that comes from some of the things she says in the published journals. It comes from references she makes. And from that quote about equivalence, she was always looking for the words because the words would help her find the paintings and the paintings would help her find the words. And there's something in that. I told you, Georgia might be on my mind, but Emily is in my heart in that regard. So we have the published journals from 1927 moving forward, but there are unpublished extracts from journals prior to that. I can't tell you when the first journals would have been written or whether they have all been published because we're still finding stuff of hers, or B, whether there are other aspects or elements that are stopping for the publication of those. So I think she was writing all her time. And one of the things I didn't have a chance to mention is she was actually a Governor General award-winning author. Along with keeping her journals, she actually would publish a series of 4 of her autobiographies, a 4-part, I should say, a 4-part autobiography. The first volume of which won her the Governor General's Award. For those of you who aren't in Canada, the Governor General's Award is the most prestigious writing award that we have. So along with having this amazing collection of paintings, we have the stories that she told about her own years of growing up, her encounters with First Nations people. My personal favorite is Life in the Boarding House because you have a sense of why she didn't paint during those years and the complexities of it. So please, along with continuing to explore the paintings, please go out and read her works. And when you read them, I have to say, you have to read them in the context of the time in which they were written, because they definitely aren't a 20th century images of British Columbia.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks for the question, Bobby.
Just a couple more quick questions here. So Ian asks about the status of the Carr charcoal drawings that are being preserved that are on paper, of course, that the Vancouver Gallery is trying to preserve with new technology.
Yeah, charcoal drawings are incredibly complicated to preserve and to ever show. So, more power and great praise to those at the Vancouver Gallery. We also had a collection, we had an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I know the National Gallery has some of her drawings. We have one collection, I think it's called Emily Carr's Sketchbook, but I will be sure that Melanie gets the correct term for the book, or the title for the book, Ian. We had one collection of her sketches that have been published. Her sketching is amazing, and her ability to capture detail. And I think it's really her ability always, before she even knew anything about, Matisse or Cézanne, before she knew the language of expressionism. I think even if you look at those early drawings, two things come clear: that it's always the emotion that she's trying to capture, and her absolute fascination with nature. Her passion for nature becomes clear. I wish I could have shown you. I showed you a snowdrop, so I was able to get a pretty good image of it as one of the charcoal drawings. But there are landscapes that she does charcoal drawings of that are stunning. Sadly, it's hard to get, like I said, the reproductions that we could show to you all on the screen today. Charcoal is hard. Charcoal is hard. For those of you who are artists, it's hard to maintain because of smudging. It's hard to maintain because of light damage. It was also hard to maintain because of paper that she was using at the time, oftentimes in journals or notebooks. The quality of the paper has something to do with the degradation of the images. I think the Vancouver Gallery, which you mentioned, Ian, is involved in trying to preserve some of them, as is the National Gallery. Sorry, I need to drink some water. The National Gallery in that process. So thanks for the question, but go and take a look. A lot of them are presently available on the National Gallery website, has a number of her charcoal drawings that you can access. And ones I sadly, like I said, couldn't show you here because in blowing them up, it just, pixelized them too much.
Yeah, I'll include a link to that. And several of you are talking about some recent shows in Montreal that featured works by Emily Carr. So I'll include a link to that. And a couple people are asking about, besides the autobiographies that you mentioned, Abe, is there a good biography of her?
Maria Tippett has a biography. I think it's might be out of print. You should be able to find it though and I'm a big fan of local libraries, which here in Canada.
Libraries.
Yes, and our libraries are just opening up for at least pickup service. So hooray for that. I have a few really great catalogs that we'll give you a link to, including things like From the Forest to the Sea. There's the book from the National Gallery exhibition just called Emily Carr. A remarkable new book, which I'm going to show you just really quickly, called Fresh Seeing. This is Emily Carr, and it's looking at her time in Paris and the influence it had on her art right through to the end, and it includes, which I find wonderful, a lecture that she would give in Victoria, I think it's in Victoria, called Fresh Seeing, which explains her process, where she talks about how it's expressive and you have to see it with your soul instead of with your eyes. And she provides a defense for that. Anyways, Fresh Seeing, French Modernism and the West Coast on Emily Carr, another great book. As always, we'll give you a list of some of my favorite books on the painter. So please go out and explore.
Yes, definitely. All right, that just about wraps it up. And several of you are asking for more Armchair Art Tour series. Well, I don't know. We'll have to talk about it. But I do want to, Wendy and Samantha. It's just we've done 3 Armchair Art Tour series with Wendy now, and thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Wendy. It's been incredible. Just amazing. We are not done with our webinars. As I mentioned, we have Dr. Bruce Meyer from from Ontario who's going to be talking on August 6th about Canadian writers of World War I. He's a true expert in this area, and it's going to be fascinating. And then I'll be back the next week talking about American writers of World War I. You know, you think of British writers, but there were lots of Canadians and Americans writing too. And of course, July 30th, the literary quiz. Look for details very soon on the Classical Pursuits website. There's going to be a small entry fee. All the money is going to go to local charities, including libraries. More details soon. And I want to close with a comment from Julie.
Hey, Julie.
So Julie says, strong, independent, solitary. Wendy, you've shown all three artists to be uniquely talented individuals. Not a one of them would have married in the beautiful place you and your husband chose. It seems that each followed art, not relationships. They were talented, yes, but productive in ways that their autonomy allowed. Thanks for giving us so much to think about in this series. I so look forward to meeting you one day, Wendy, but you've shared so much of yourself in your presentations that I think I already know you as a friend.
Oh my gosh, Julie, thank you for that. What a lovely thing. And can I say thank you to all of you. You know what strange times we're living in. And I have loved doing this series. And we'll see about continuing. We'll maybe we'll be in conversation as we go into the fall about doing some more armchair tours. And but thank you all, because I've received so many kind comments from you all. And it has meant, I know, a lot to many of you, but it's meant so much for me to be able to share with you. I mean, Tom Thompson and Algonquin Park, which I have a love for, and Georgia O'Keeffe, who's, I told you, Georgia's always on my mind, and Emily Carr, who's in my heart in so many ways. So thank you for your kindness and your time. I know it's a true gift that you have given me. And I have to just stop for a minute and thank the two people that you hardly ever see. First, Melanie, who facilitates Classical Pursuits and this series. She is one of the hardest working humans I know. And Melanie, I will later today raise a glass of wine to you. Actually, I'll have a last word because I know both you and I love that cocktail. So thank you for all of your hard work. And Samantha Clark, who you never get to see, is from Worldwide Quest, and she sets up the webinar, and she makes sure that my cursor isn't in the wrong place and that I'm correctly positioned and that I have a beautiful background for me. Thank you, Samantha, for all your hard work. I can't begin to tell you. You make it so easy for me to do something that is in many ways so foreign to what I normally do. So thank you, both of you, and thank you everybody who's participated. It has been a true delight. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everyone. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Samantha. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy. And Melanie, you were such a good host for her. I love the two of you. I can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah, no, it's been so much fun, so much fun. Again, we're off next week. We are back June 30th, literary quiz. So get thinking, get your team together, everybody, and we'll see you there.
Pressure, Melanie, the pressure.
Pressure, I know. It'll be fun, I promise. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.